Hello everyone! Thank you for watching my card time presentation. I hope that you are all well and that you and your families remain safe and healthy during this time. Today I will be talking to you about contraception, also known as birth control. Before I officially begin my presentation, I would like to just warn you that this topic is a little touchy, and since I will be talking about sex, things might get a little bit uncomfortable. Still, I ask that you please keep your mind open about this information presented in my card time, since this is a very serious topic. Also, if it doesn't apply to you already, there is a chance that it may apply to you in the future, especially with college growing near, or it could even apply to someone else close to you. Therefore, regardless of your views about these subjects, it is still important for us all to be educated about this increasingly discussed topic in this day and age. I would like to begin by familiarizing you with some key terms that will hopefully give you more of an insight about what contraception is and how it works in the reproductive system. The words that are in the bolded letters on the screen are the ones that I believe are the most important ones to know in order to have a clear understanding about this topic. The first definition I would like to go over is contraception. That is the deliberate prevention of conception or impregnation. The next word is closely related to contraception, and it's birth control. Birth control is the control of the number of children or offspring born, especially by preventing or lessening the frequency of conception. Conception is the time when sperm travels up through the vagina into the uterus and fertilizes an egg found in the fallopian tube. And the reason why I have the word conception in bolded on the screen is because it is a very important thing regarding contraception. The next term is abortifacient, which is an agent such as a drug that induces abortion. The next word, as you all know, is abortion, which is the termination of a pregnancy after conception, accompanied by, resulting in, or closely followed by the death of the embryo or fetus. Abstinence is self-restraint, self-denial, or forbearance from sexual practices, or in simpler terms, just not having sex. And finally, family planning is a concept of limiting the size of families through the spacing or prevention of pregnancies. I have a few more definitions on the screen. The first one is ovum, which is the female reproductive cell or gamete of animals, which is capable of developing into a new individual, or a baby. People also refer to this term as an egg. Ovulation is a process in which an egg is released from the ovary, pushed down the fallopian tubes, and is made available to be fertilized by a sperm. And a sperm is, as you guys probably know, is a male reproductive cell. The uterus is the enlarged, muscular, expandable portion of the oviduct in which the fertilized ovum implants and develops or rests during prenatal development, or it's also called the womb. The endometrium is a mucous membrane lining the uterus. Estrogen is a female sex hormone that helps control and guide sexual development, including the physical changes associated with puberty. And finally, progesterone, also known as the synthetic form progestin, is a female sex hormone that prepares the uterus to receive and sustain fertilized eggs. Now I will be going over a few statistics with you guys. The first statistic says that about 70% of women of reproductive age, which is between 15 to 44, are actually at risk of unintended pregnancy. So that means that they are not trying to be pregnant, but they are sexually active and they could be pregnant if they and their partners don't use a contraceptive method or they just don't use it correctly. The second statistic that I have says that couples who don't use any contraceptives at all will have about an 85% chance of having a pregnancy within the course of a year. In addition, more than 99% of women aged 15 to 44 who have ever had sex have used at least one form of contraceptive methods. Of that number, about 60% are still currently using one. About 77% of married women use a contraceptive method as opposed to only 42% of unmarried women, and that is because married women are more likely to be sexually active with their husbands. In addition, 89% of at-risk Catholics and 90% of at-risk Protestants currently use a contraceptive method. Among sexually experienced religious women, 99% of Catholics and Protestants have ever used some form of contraception. 4 out of 5 sexually experienced women have also used the pill. So that just goes to tell you how popular the pill has gotten. In addition, the use of the male condom has increased from 52% to 93% between 1982 to 2010. And that is a pretty huge jump. And finally, my last statistic says that among teen females aged 15 to 19, 42% have had sex, and among teen males, the percent was 44%. So that's also a pretty large number for teens because that's a little bit less than half. Basically, what do these statistics tell you? They tell you that sex has become increasingly prevalent in today's day and age. So, according to these statistics, you might become one of them soon. It is important for everyone to be educated about contraception so that we can be safe, and so we could also decide for ourselves if it is really something that we want to do also. In addition, even if you do in fact intend on waiting until marriage to have sex, you should still be informed about both sides of the argument about whether we as big biblical Christians should be able to use contraception in a sexual relationship. God created sex, but we want to encourage using sexual practices in a positive way that honor Him, and part of that is knowing to what extent it is intended purely for procreation or pleasure as well. So, as I continue, I'm going to talk about what exactly happens in the female body on a regular basis. So during the menstrual cycle, many hormones are released, provoking a chain reaction. Something in the brain called the pituitary gland releases something called follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH for short. And what happens is that it stimulates the growth of follicles and a premature egg in the ovaries. These follicles then release estrogen, which prepares the uterine lining and triggers the brain to release another hormone called luteinizing hormone, or also called LH. LH then triggers ovulation, in which eggs are released in the fallopian tubes, where it will spend around 12 to 24 hours waiting to be fertilized by a sperm cell. If it is not fertilized, which is the usual case, it begins to dissolve and is shed away with the endometrium during menstruation. Birth control pills modify these hormone levels. By increasing progestin levels in the body, it actually tricks the body into thinking it's already pregnant or that ovulation has already occurred. And this happens because it effectively decreases the levels of FSH and LH, and the cycle comes to a halt. So now I will be going over the types of contraceptive methods. The first type of contraceptive methods I will be talking about are called barrier methods. And the reason why they're called barrier methods is because they actually form a physical barrier between the sperm and the ovum. And these are used each time during sexual intercourse, which means you have to use a new one every time. The male condom is the first contraceptive method I'll be talking about, and despite popular belief, it's actually only about 85% effective. It's not 99% or even 100% like some people might think. And this is put over the male penis, as most people already know. The second barrier method is right here, which looks similar to the male condom, but this is actually a female condom. And this is inserted directly in the vagina during sexual intercourse. And this is a little bit lower in effectiveness because it is 79% effective. The third thing over here is called a birth control sponge. And this forms a barrier around the cervix, but it also contains something called spermicides, which kills sperm. And I will be talking about spermicides in a few minutes. This thing over here is called a diaphragm, and it is something that you put over the cervix in the vagina, and it blocks some of the area around the cervix too. And this is 88% effective. The thing next to it right here is more of a thimble shape, and it is called a cervical cap. And what this does is similar to what the diaphragm does, except this fits a little bit more tightly around the cervix itself. And this is a little bit lower in effectiveness to 71 to 86% because it covers a smaller area. The last type of barrier method that I am going to be talking about is called spermicides. And spermicides can actually be used by themselves without any additional barrier methods, but it is recommended that you use it with at least one of these. So spermicides can be found in different forms, and that includes gel, cream, foam, fill, tablets, or suppositories. So there's many different forms of spermicides that you can use. By itself, it is about 79% effective, and it is used each time you have sexual intercourse, and it should be inserted about an hour before you do it. Something to note is that both types of condoms, as well as sponges, are disposable and cannot be reused for more than one time you have sexual intercourse. However, diaphragms and cervical caps can be reused for several years. In addition, condoms are the only types of contraception that actually protect against sexually transmitted diseases. So even if you use another type of contraceptive, that doesn't necessarily mean that you will be protected from STDs. The next type of method that I will be talking about are called hormonal methods. And basically, like it suggests, it puts hormones in the woman's body to kill sperm. So the first type of hormonal method is called the birth control patch. And you replace this weekly, and it's usually put on the arm, but it could be found in other parts of the body. And like I said, it is to be replaced weekly, and it is 91% effective. So that's already a jump from the barrier methods, which range from the 70s to 80s, and now these hormonal methods are ranging throughout the 90s. The next type of hormonal method that is not a glow stick, by the way. This is called a birth control ring. Please do not use a glow stick as a hormonal method because it won't work. So this should be replaced monthly, and it is also 91% effective. This, as it looks like, is the birth control shot, and that is 94% effective. And what you do is you actually get that every 3 months, which takes a pretty good amount of time to wear off. And this thing over here, that is a birth control implant, and that's 99% effective, which is a very, very high success rate. In addition to that, it lasts a long time as well, to every 3 to 5 years that you change it. And that seems like a long time until you compare it to the intrauterine device, or also called the IUD. That is also 99% effective, and it even lasts between 3 to 12 years. So that's a really long time that you could have an IUD. And that will be prescribed by a doctor, and that is supposed to be fit by a doctor too. The last type of hormonal method I will be talking about is called the birth control pill. And this is a very common type of contraceptive that I'm sure that you guys have all heard before. So the way that a birth control pill works is that there are 3 rows of the active pills and 1 row of inactive pills that are also called placebo pills. And the reason why that there are inactive pills within birth control pill packets is so that you can maintain a regular cycle, and basically what it does is that it weakens, or sometimes it even stops, cycles from happening. I will now be talking to you guys about an extreme form of contraception, which is surgical contraception. And there are 2 forms. The first is for men, and the other is for women. So the type for men is called a vasectomy, and usually what happens in the male reproductive system is that the sperm is produced in the testes or the testicles, and it is stored in the epididymis to be transferred out through the vas deferens out the urethra of the penis. So during a vasectomy, they cut the vas deferens, or a part of it, so that the sperm can't come out of the penis. So the vas deferens can be reattached either biologically or you could get the vasectomy reversed. But it's very rare for the biological processes to actually reverse itself, but it is possible. A funny story that I have actually is from my father, who told me that his coworker got a vasectomy, but he still was able to get his wife pregnant. But it's good for them because they ended up keeping the child and the wife gave birth to a son, which is good for them. But that just proves that vasectomies are 99% effective, but there is still a chance for failure, even if it is a small chance. The same applies for what is called tubal ligation, which is in women. So what happens normally in women, as I explained, is that the eggs come out of the ovaries through the fallopian tubes and into the uterus. But during tubal ligation, or also called getting your tubes tied, the fallopian tubes are literally cut or tied so that the eggs can't come out through the fallopian tubes. So tubal ligation can't really be reversed safely. So once you get a tubal ligation, it really is permanent. Something that could be noted about surgical contraception is that it is very effective, but it's also extremely costly. Not only financially, because it is very expensive, but it also puts a huge toll on your actual body because you are getting a surgery. But it's still effective, and you don't really have to worry much about other forms of contraception for the rest of your life. I will now be talking about something called the withdrawal method, or as some of you probably know it as, the pull-out method. And basically what it is that before a male ejaculates into the vagina, he pulls out before any sperm can get in. However, this doesn't have a super high success rate. It's only about 78% effective, but it's still better than nothing. However, it's strongly suggested that the withdrawal method is used coupled with another type of contraceptive methods in order for it to be more effective. The next type of method is the rhythm method, which is basically tracking your fertility cycle. So during a menstruation cycle, the woman has about 9 or more days of increased fertility. So during this method, it is important to track when a woman is most fertile and therefore most likely to get pregnant. The rhythm method is also used to track when your period is supposed to come, and if you have sexual intercourse, it can tell you how many more days you should be expected to get your period. And obviously, if you don't get your period within the time span that your method tells you that you are, you're about to get pregnant, or maybe your period just came late. The next method I will be talking to you about is abstinence, and I already told this to you in the definitions, but abstinence is just not having sex at all. And it is to be noted that abstinence is the only type of contraception that actually is 100% effective. It's the only foolproof way of you just never to get pregnant at all. So if you're scared to be pregnant, just don't have sex. And that's the only way that you can 100% not get pregnant. The last form of contraceptive that I will be talking to you about is called Plan B, which is also called emergency contraceptives. And this is actually a very controversial topic because there's a wide dispute on how it really works and whether or not it should be considered an abortifacient or that it kills babies. So the reason why it's called emergency contraceptives is because you can use it up to 5 days after unprotected sex, but it's recommended to take it as soon as possible within the first 3 days. So the way that Plan B works that makes it really controversial is that if you take it before ovulation, it's supposed to prevent the egg from being produced and flow through the fallopian tubes. But what if you take it after ovulation already happened? Well, Plan B is also thought to be able to thicken the cervical mucus so that sperm cannot get through to the egg. But if there are sperm that get through to the egg, they come back to the uterus where the wall is already shed. So that means that it's not hospitable for babies to be made, making it an accidental abortion. That is the belief of some people who do not believe that Plan B is ethical. Plan B is usually used during unprotected sex or if other contraceptives were used incorrectly. One example of this can be if you're using a diaphragm and it slips out of place, or you are missing a few birth control pills at the same time, or if you're using a condom and it broke by accident. Basically, if you take Plan B, the longer you wait, the less effective it will be. So it's recommended that you take it very soon after sex. And something that sets this type of contraceptive apart from other hormonal methods is because it actually uses a different hormone, which is called levonorgestrel. So that's another thing to be noted. And one more thing about Plan B is that it should not be used as a primary form of contraceptives, which is why it's called Plan B. And the reason for this is because there's very high levels of hormones, and if you use it multiple times, it can really do bad things to your body. So this is the final form of birth control that I will be talking about. So I will move on to history. But before I go to my next slide, I want you guys to think about how long you think that birth control has really been around for. Some people assume that it's a pretty modern concept and that it hasn't been introduced until fairly recently. However, this is actually not the case. It actually dates back to thousands of years before the birth of Jesus Christ himself. So I will be going over the ancient history of contraception first. So around 3000 BC, the condom was actually invented in Egypt. So basically, when they created the condom, they used things like fish bladders and linen sheets and also even animal intestines. And at the time, these condoms weren't even used to prevent pregnancy. They were mostly used just to prevent the spread of STDs. It wasn't until later that condoms were actually used to prevent pregnancy. However, people also used other forms of contraceptives to prevent pregnancy, and that includes mixing honey and acacia leaves. And they also drank very, very dangerous substances such as lead, mercury, and arsenic. And as you could probably imagine, it led to severe damages to the kidneys, lungs, and brain. But surprisingly, it actually worked as a contraceptive, even though it was so dangerous. However, the most popular form of contraceptives at the time is a plant called silphium, which is a plant that's pretty related to fennel. And it was actually native to North Africa. But unfortunately for the people at the time, silphium was so popular that it was harvested to extinction. The last method that they used at that time was actually a method that they still use now, and that is coitus interruptus, which we call now the withdrawal method. Around 1850 BC, something called the pessary was invented, and a pessary is something that is inserted in the vagina to block or kill sperm, which is similar to contraceptives today. Pessaries still exist today, but they aren't nearly as common as they were back then. And around 1500 BC, they introduced the concept of spermicides, which they basically just soaked linen sheets in chemical solutions and dried them before using. I will now be talking to you about what is called the Comstock era, and this happened during the time of the Civil War to after. So the Comstock era basically began when between 1838 and 1844, a man named Charles Goodyear invented and patented vulcanized rubber, which is like a latex material. Rubber was then used to manufacture condoms of a much higher quality than they were used back then, as well as a vaginal diaphragm. So this picture on the right here is a picture of one of the early forms of vulcanized rubber condoms. And this was pretty revolutionary at the time, because the need for contraceptives was huge, because at the time, the average woman in the US gave birth to around 8 children. So that is a lot of children for each woman to be giving birth to. And that was actually the highest birth rate of the time. And that is a pretty big jump because now the average birth rate of women is about 3 children. This also changed a lot in terms of demographics in society because there was a huge increase of women in the workforce. And the reason why this happened is because there were a lot less pregnancies happening. So women didn't have to take as much time off because pregnancies and having children mostly prevented people from having time in work. In addition to more women in the workforce, there were also a lot of immigrants coming to America. And at the time, many Americans actually blamed the immigrants for tainting the moral fabric of Americans with their liberal views towards sex. Because prior to this time, contraceptives were not really talked about. And sex was a very conservative topic that was not very talked about. In addition, the social classes violently changed, and the upper class began to be worried that members of the lower working classes were procreating at a faster rate. Gender roles also changed as a result of the production of condoms. And this is because women were growing to be more independent and were taking over more masculine roles by working instead of focusing more on building families. During this time, abortion was also legal until the time of something called quickening, which meant that the woman could physically feel the baby move. From 1830 to 1860, 1 in 5 pregnancies resulted in an abortion, and that is a really high percentage. That is 20% of all pregnancies, and they just result to abortion. So, as a result of this increasing popularity of condoms, and because there was a huge increase in women's roles in society, a lot of men began to feel threatened by this. And one example of these men was a dry goods merchant and anti-obscenity crusader named Anthony Comstock. And he actually pushed for the U.S. Congress to pass what was called the Comstock Laws. And this made all forms of contraception illegal. So, as a result of this, many variants of the Comstock Act emerged in 24 different states, and some states were a little bit more lenient to advertising and mailing contraceptives, but others actually banned all usage and all mention of them whatsoever. And one of these examples is Connecticut. During this time, however, the contraceptive industry continued to flourish, but this was only able to happen under the guise that their products were promoting feminine hygiene, and they weren't even allowed to advertise them as pregnancy prevention. So now I will be talking to you guys about a woman named Margaret Sanger, who was a very key person in helping the contraceptive industry to flourish. So Margaret Sanger was only 19 years old when her mother died, and this happened because she gave birth to 11 children, and she died of exhaustion. So traumatized by her mom's passing, Margaret Sanger became a nurse as a result and helped survivors of failed abortions. And this later grew into the desire to create better contraceptives, especially a birth control pill. So many people have probably heard about Margaret Sanger and assume that she was pro-abortion because of her fight for contraception, but it's actually quite the opposite. She was actually pro-contraception because of the fact that it would help reduce the abortion rate. So in 1960, Margaret Sanger opened the first birth control clinic in the United States. However, this wasn't very successful because the next year she was deemed guilty of maintaining a public nuisance because she was disobeying the Comstock laws, and she was sentenced to jail for 30 days. And she was actually jailed quite a lot of times, but she continued doing business each time after she was released. So she was very persistent in fighting for what she stood for. In 1921, her contributions continued when she founded the organization that would later become Planned Parenthood that we still have today. In 1938, in a case involving Margaret Sanger, a judge lifted the federal ban on birth control, which ended the official Comstock era. However, even though the federal ban was lifted, there were still some states that still continued to hold their own laws about contraception. Connecticut was being one of the more extreme cases, and that still banned any use of birth control. When this happened, the usage of diaphragms was very popular. However, in 1930 to 1960, Lysol was the most popular form of contraceptives, and it began to be advertised as a feminine hygiene product, and it was so popular, even though it was proven to not even work as a contraceptive. You may think this is ridiculous, and that's because it is, but this was actually proposed by alleged prominent European doctors, but the AMA later found out that they weren't real doctors. So, yes, they later found out that this didn't work as a contraceptive 30 years later, and why it took so long for them to figure this out, I have no idea, but that's what they thought at the time. So, in 1950, while she was in her 80s, Margaret Sanger began the research to make the first human birth control pill. So you would think that at this age, she would be satisfied for all that she has done already in her life, but apparently not. So she still wasn't done standing up for what she believed in, which I think is incredible. So she raised about $150,000 for the project, which you might think isn't a lot, but when you think about it, it's actually equivalent to about $1.6 million in modern money. So that is a lot of money for this project. So the research was done by two scientists named Gregory Pincus and John Rock. In 1957, the birth control pill was finally approved, but only for the treatment of menstrual disorders. So it wasn't until 1960 that it was allowed to be used to prevent pregnancy. So 6 years after this happened, Margaret Sanger actually died. So now I'll be talking about what I would like to call the rise of the sexual revolution, or the climax for the fight for sexual freedom. So in the 1920s to the 1950s, the entire concept of birth control was completely revolutionary, and it began to raise a lot of questions about personal freedom, liberal and conservative values, government intervention, religion and politics, and ideas regarding sexual morality and social welfare. So in 1965, the Supreme Court gave married couples the right to use birth control, and they stated that this is because it was protected in the Constitution as a right to privacy. And this happened during the Griswold versus Connecticut court decision. So in doing so, the Supreme Court struck down all the rest of the Comstock laws that banned contraception. And this includes in the state of Connecticut, which I had stated earlier was one of the more strict states regarding contraception. In 1968, the FDA started approving intrauterine devices, also called IUDs, and they brought early versions like the Lips Loop and the Copper 7 to the market. In 1970, however, the safety of the pill began to be under question, and feminists challenged the safety at well-publicized congressional hearings. So as a result of this huge uprise, the formulation of the pill was actually changed, and the package insert for prescription drugs became into being. The amount of hormones in the pill before 1970 was about 100 times more than what is in the pill today. And this is because there was reports of a lot of blood clotting and very dangerous amounts of hormones. So the formulation was altered, and the warnings about side effects and safety of the pill was added to the package at this time. In 1972, the Supreme Court decision Baird v. Eisenstadt legalized birth control for all citizens of the country, irrespective of marital status. So in other words, people who weren't married were now able to use the pill as well. In 1973, the Roe v. Wade decision, which is pretty well known today, allowed legalized abortion throughout the United States. In the 1980s, pills with low doses of hormones were introduced along with a new copper IUD named Paragard, which was later introduced in 1998. Now I will be talking about more recent developments to contraception. So it actually wasn't until 1998 to 1999 where Plan B was approved by the FDA. And at the time, it was marketed to allow women to take pills up to 72 hours after sex to prevent pregnancy. Now it's said that it can be taken up to 5 days after sex. So during the 2000s, there was a rapid expansion in method availability and improvements in safety and effectiveness, and that includes the introduction of Mirena, a new levonorgestrel-releasing IUD, Ortho-Evra, a hormonal patch, NuvaRing, which was a vaginal ring, Assure, a method of transcervical female sterilization, Implanon, a single rod implant, and FC2, which was an improved female condom. So in 2003, it was when the first continuous birth control pill was approved by the FDA. And prior to this, birth control pills were actually a one-time use thing. In the 2010s, the growing use of copper IUD for emergency contraception actually occurred. And Plan B was actually available without a prescription on drugstore shelves in 2013. So prior to this, you had to get a prescription for a Plan B, but now you can get it on your own without a prescription at any drugstore that you want. So this is something that I thought was very interesting, but within 2019 to 2020, so within the past year, male birth control was being researched, and that includes a non-surgical vasectomy called RISUG, and that stands for Reversible Inhibition of Sperm Under Guidance, and it's effectively an injection behind man's penises. So I thought that was really interesting. So now I will be talking to you about a somewhat current event called China's one-child policy. That is an example of a society that strongly approved of contraceptives. So the one-child policy happened in the late 1970s when President Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese communist leader, imposed a policy of one child per family. So no family was allowed to have more than one child. And this was done as a form of state-sponsored birth control. So China began demanding that women be fitted with an intrauterine device, or IUD, after they had their first child. And if they already had 2 children, they were forced to be sterilized with surgery. And these were provided to all women for free. So that's pretty crazy because IUDs are fairly expensive. At the time, those who refused risked that their children would be denied access to public schools and health insurance. So that's a pretty big risk. And civil servants and state employees who refused also lost their jobs. So this was a pretty big deal at the time. From 1980 to 2014, according to official statistics, 324 million Chinese women were fitted with IUDs, and 107 million also underwent tubal ligations, or as it is commonly said, got their tubes tied. And that is a really large number. In October 2015, with China's aging population and its workforce shrinking, President Xi Jinping abandoned the one-child policy. Instead, the Communist Party encouraged couples to not only have a second child, but to bear more children. So this actually backfired on them, this one-child policy. So what is the controversy surrounding birth control? Why are people talking about this so much? So there's basically 2 sides of the controversy. The first side says it is okay to use contraceptive methods. And the second side says it is wrong to use contraceptive methods. So is it right or is it wrong is essentially the question. And the areas of discussing I will be talking about today are the morality aspect, the effects on health and safety, the practicality usage, and finally, the biblical perspective. So here are the moral arguments in favor of contraception. The first argument being that birth control is a right for everyone. It was originally legalized under the argument that individuals have a fundamental right to privacy, and that includes the right of married couples to control their own fertility. In 1995, the Fourth World Conference on Women made a statement that The human rights of women include their right to have control over and decide freely and responsibly on matters related to their sexuality, including sexual and reproductive health. In addition to this, there's a huge feminist movement that says, my body, my choice. And essentially, like it says, people argue that no one should have the right to tell them what they should and shouldn't do with their own bodies, which goes with the first statement that it takes away their rights to what they do with themselves. Another argument in favor of contraception is that it prevents abortions. So this was actually the argument that was the driving force that inspired Margaret Sanger to fight for contraception in the first place. Even those opposed to the usage of contraception can agree that it is much less harmless than getting an abortion. In other words, it's the better of two evils. In addition, almost half of all pregnancies in the US were unplanned as of 2006, and 43% of those unplanned pregnancies ended in abortion. So that's pretty much a lot of abortions. And 95% of unplanned pregnancies were to the US women who weren't trying to get pregnant, but they weren't using birth control or were using it incorrectly or inconsistently. In addition, if women who currently lack the means to sexual health information as well as proper contraception were allowed to access these reproductive tools, an estimated 35 million abortions and 76,000 maternal deaths would be prevented each year. And that is a crazy number. So, in addition to those arguments, there's also the factor that increasing the usage of contraception could prevent children from being in homes that are unfit for children. It's also time to come with the facts. Not everyone is cut out to be a parent. What if a baby is born from an unplanned pregnancy to parents that are so resentful of having accidentally gotten pregnant that they actually lash out at their child? Statistics show that unplanned pregnancy result in a higher risk for abuse and neglect to the children born. Even if their parents put their children in foster care, it doesn't necessarily equate to a better life for the child. A study of foster children in Oregon and Washington State found that nearly 1/3 of foster children were reported being abused by a foster parent or another adult in a foster home. That study doesn't even include the cases of foster children who abuse each other. So that is a really high number of foster children that face abuse. And there's also the separate threat of teen pregnancies, which of course leads to the possibility that the child is born to parents who are not mature or responsible enough to be able to properly take care of a child. Now here's some practical arguments in favor of contraception. The first one being that it prevents overpopulation, and this is because there are fewer children born, so there's less of a demand for natural resources. And you guys were even able to see this in the one-child policy, when the usage of contraception did drastically decrease the population. Another practical argument is that it reduces poverty. Studies show that the larger a family is, the more likely it is for them to be poorer than a family with fewer children or no children at all. In addition, a study found that children born after the introduction of federally funded family planning programs are 7.4% less likely to live in poverty and 4.3% less likely to live near poverty. In addition, it also promotes education by allowing women to delay their child rearing years. Between 1968 and 1979, women's college enrollment increased by nearly 12% for women who had early legal access to contraception, with their dropout rate decreasing by 35%. And this is likely due to the increasing popularity of contraceptives after the legalization in 1965. The positive effects on health and safety include the fact that there are other uses for birth control other than preventing pregnancy, which a lot of people don't realize considering the fact that it's called birth control. However, studies say that women who take the pill for at least a year are actually 40% less likely to develop both uterine and ovarian cancer, which is pretty huge. Research also suggests that birth control pills lower the risk of ovarian cancer by 27% and the risk of endometrial cancer by 50% compared to those who have never taken oral contraceptives. In addition, other benefits of birth control include helping to regulate periods, it controls acne, reduces cramps, relieves symptoms of premenstrual syndrome or PMS, and it also protects against pelvic inflammatory disease, which is a major cause of infertility. And the reason why it does this is because it thickens cervical mucus to prevent bacteria from entering the vagina and possibly the uterus and the fallopian tubes. In addition, there's also huge scientific evidence that people who have more sex are happier and healthier. And this is due to the fact that it lowers blood pressure, releases cortisol and epinephrine, which is also called adrenaline, and that in turn reduces stress. It also increases endorphins as well as the hormone oxytocin, which gives you feelings of calmness and contentment. It can also be proven to boost self-esteem. Here are the theological arguments in favor of contraception. One of the main arguments that people have is that the early church actually didn't properly understand contraception beyond abortion. So they really misconstrued contraception as equivalent to abortion, and that is actually not true. And this is because contraception prevents the egg from being fertilized and doesn't affect the eggs that were already fertilized. And at the time, they had no idea about this because they didn't have the same knowledge or technology that we have today. With that logic, it's argued by pro-contraceptive people that consulting the moral sense of early church leaders on contraception is the same thing as getting our moral views of surgery from people who lived before modern antibiotics when doctors were more like butchers than surgeons. In addition, it's argued that early families were also only against contraception because at the time it didn't make sense for them. For some families, it was more financially beneficial to have more kids because more kids meant more help in the work and service to the family. Another piece of evidence in favor of contraception is that God intended for sex to be pleasurable and to create intimacy between a couple. And there's actually verses in the Bible that support this, one of which being Genesis 2:24. And that reads, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." And this demonstrates that when a married couple comes together, they act as one unit, emphasizing the intimacy that he designs for couples to have through sex. In addition, 1 Corinthians 7:3 says, "The husband should fulfill his wife's sexual needs, and the wife should fulfill her husband's needs too." 2 verses later, it also says, "Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer, but then come again so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control." So despite what some people commonly think, the Bible doesn't completely hate sex. The Bible actually encourages sex to be able to provide intimacy between a couple. The Bible doesn't approve of sex being abused and for it to be used in a lustful manner. And that is the argument for people in favor of contraception. So here are the arguments against contraception. And again, I will be starting with the moral arguments against it. So the first argument is a very strong view, and that is the idea that some people think it could possibly kill babies. And that is a pretty serious offense against contraception. So the reason why some people think this is because even though some are not abortifacient, they still affect the endometrium, and in turn, babies are accidentally aborted without women even knowing that they're killing babies. And this is because it is believed that the endometrium lining gets too thin over time, making it unable to be hospitable for fertilized eggs. So basically, even after you're done using a birth control pill and you're trying to have a baby, you could still get your egg fertilized, but when it comes back to the uterus, the lining's too thin, so it actually dies because it can't live. So essentially, that is what some people think is an example of chemical abortion. In addition, it is believed that contraception is immoral because it promotes lustful behavior and separates sex from reproduction. and it normalizes casual sex. So because of this, it no longer makes sex as special. When people have multiple sex partners or have sex multiple times, it doesn't make it special anymore. It's the same effect as if you are tapping someone multiple times and the first time they react to it, but the more times you tap them, the less that they're going to pay attention to it because it doesn't affect them as strongly anymore because they're used to it. In addition, condoms prevent the spread of STDs, but at the same time, it promotes having multiple sexual partners. So this is also a pretty huge deal because at that, sex actually causes intimacy. And when someone has intimacy, it can really lead to heartbreak. In addition, contraception makes it easier for people to have sex outside of marriage and other irresponsible relationships because it reduces the risk of pregnancy through those relationships. So when a person is constantly having sex with this contraception, they become too dependent on contraceptives and assume that they're essentially invincible from getting pregnant, which is just not the case. And the more that they have sex, the less that they're going to think that they're actually going to get pregnant and the more at risk they end up being. This is something that a lot of people don't think about, but contraception is actually often misused in mass population control programs in a very racist way. One example of this is that in the 1960s, many African Americans around the country deeply distrusted the motivation behind government-funded birth control clinics. And that's because they feared that it was an attempt to limit Black population growth and stunt Black political power. And this is a very reasonable thing to think because this is still happening when there was segregation. To further back up their initial beliefs, it was actually proven that Margaret Sanger actually was a racist. A quote from 1923 says, "These two words, meaning birth control, sum up our whole philosophy. It means the release and cultivation of the better elements in our society and the gradual suppression, elimination, and eventual extinction of defective stocks, those human weeds which threaten the blooming of the finest flowers of American civilization." And the weeds that she's referring to in this quote refer to Black people, and the finest flowers refer to white people. In addition, there's another quote from her saying, "We do not want word to go out that we want to exterminate the Negro population, and the minister is the man who can straighten out that idea if it ever occurs to any of their more rebellious members." In addition, it was also shown that Margaret Sanger actually met with the women's branch of the KKK and presented a speech there. So this is a really strong argument against Margaret Sanger because it proves that she actually did have malicious intent in creating the birth control pill. Not only was she supporting women's freedom and sexual reproductive health, she was also promoting eugenics and racist values. To further this claim, 40% of abortions in the U.S. today are Black babies. In addition, the U.S. Black population is 13%. So some might say that Margaret Sanger's philosophy even worked, and that is all because of contraception. If there was no contraception, there would be more Black people in the United States, and not as many people would be aborted. Here's a cartoon showing the women's right to choose, and that contraception actually involves a very difficult moral choice. So the first side, the angel, is the idea that thou shalt not kill, which is a basic commandment given by God in the Old Testament of the Bible. And the other side is a quote from Margaret Sanger, which says, "More children from the fit, less from the unfit. That is the chief issue in birth control," which is another eugenics quote. Here's another slide showing the ugly history of contraception. And the first picture is a picture of Margaret Sanger actually speaking to the KKK. And even though it's actually been proven that this isn't a real picture, this still happened. And I still included this picture to show effect that she actually did have racist values. The picture on the right is also showing the death of a nation, meaning the death of the Black population in America due to the production of birth control. Now I will be talking to you about the practical arguments against contraception. The first one being that the more common means of contraception are not even that effective. And I already showed you at the beginning of this presentation that condoms, which are very popular in usage, are only 85% effective. And that still leaves a huge margin of error if they're not used correctly or if it breaks. So basically, even though it's easy to get, it's still not as effective as it would be if you just didn't have sex. So, in addition, the more effective means of contraception are extremely expensive and could be thousands of dollars. And plus, they also require a prescription or a visit to a doctor, which is a process. The table on the left shows just how expensive some of these contraceptives can be. If you go down to the cervical cap, it's $75, and that is already a lot for something that's the size of like this. In addition, if you go even more further down, the implant could be $800 and even $300 for removal. And when you go down to the surgical sterilization, which is almost 100% effective, it could be up to $6,000, and that could be very costly for most people. Another argument is that too much use of contraceptives could actually lead to a very dangerous reduction in fertility rates. And one example of this can actually be shown through the declining populations in Europe, but especially Russia. And that is in part due to the prevalence of abortion because they mostly just had abortions instead of worrying about using contraception. And this began in 1920 when the Soviet Union became the first country in the world to legalize abortion. And as I stated just now, they actually use abortion as a means of contraception. So they didn't even distinguish between the two. So even today, the countries of the former Soviet Union maintain the highest rate of abortions in the world. In 2001, 1.31 million children were born in Russia. And that's already a lot. But when you think about it, it could get even worse. And that's because 2.11 million abortions were performed. So twice as many births were prevented than actually happened. And that is a crazy amount. To worsen the conditions, the steadily falling population became a major source of concern in the 2000s, and that even caused the military to have to reduce conscription, which is the military draft, due to the shortages of young males. So they didn't even have enough people to join the military, which is so bad. In October 2011, the Russian parliament passed a law restricting abortion to the first 12 weeks of pregnancy, with an exception of up to 22 weeks if the pregnancy was a result of rape. In addition, another example of contraceptive-rich society that backfired is from the one-child policy that I talked to you about earlier. And that is because China actually decided to end the policy because its labor force also was shrinking too much. So I actually have two charts to illustrate the abortion and population decline in Russia. So on the chart on the left, it starts off with the births being quite a lot more than the deaths. However, later on, it started being even less than that. So that's what I told you before, how abortions became to be 2 times as many as the amount of births that actually happened. And this is shown over here. So it starts off in 1957 with the abortion rate being 125% of the amounts of birth. And over here in 1966, it actually increased to 275%. And that is a huge amount. And even though it started to decline, it increased a little bit and it's still declining today. However, if contraceptives weren't a thing, this would have been prevented in the first place. Now I will be talking about the health and safety arguments against contraception. So the first argument is that some aspects are not even safe or healthy for mothers. Contraceptives like the pill allow people to have more sexual partners and thus increases the possibility of catching a sexually transmitted disease. In addition, it helps make it harder for people to be pregnant later in their life due to the added hormones in their body and the thinning of the endometrium. And that was what I discussed earlier, how some people think that Plan B is an abortifacient, and that is because of this argument. There are also a lot of negative side effects to contraception, which some argue could be even worse than the benefits are good. So the side effects of using birth control methods include blood clotting, heart attacks, stroke, gallbladder disease, and even cancer of the reproductive organs. And that is also very major. So that could be very detrimental to a woman's health. In addition, it could also very negatively affect your mental health as well. Studies have shown that women on the pill are 23 more likely to be treated for depression. In addition, for girls aged 15 to 19, basically our demographic at Timothy Christian, there's about an 80% chance of being prescribed antidepressants after taking the pill. And that is a huge problem. So basically it's saying that being on birth control increases rates of depression. So here are the theological arguments against contraception. And the first argument is that it ruins God's plans and purposes for sex. Originally, sex was created in order to be able to procreate, and it was only able to be used within the context of a marriage. Now with contraceptives, it reduces the meaning of human sexuality for just pleasure, and that acts as a gateway to other sexual sins, such as pornography and homosexuality, and that further reduces marriage and separates you further from God. And this is because the more people have sex, the more people feel invincible using contraceptives, the more daring they are, and the more they want to explore their sexuality. So that's why people say that it's a gateway to other sexual sins. And in the Bible, it even says that people who have these sexual sins sin against their own body, which is a pretty serious thing. In the Bible, in 2 Corinthians 12:21, it says, "I'm afraid that when I come again, my God will humble me before you, and I will be grieved over many who have sinned earlier and have not repented of the impurity, sexual sin, and debauchery in which they have indulged." And debauchery is a pretty old term, so a lot of people might not know what it is, but basically it's just an indulge of sexual pleasure. In addition, 1 Thessalonians 4:3-5 says, "It is God's will that you should be sanctified, that you should avoid sexual immorality, that each of you should learn to control your own body in a way that it is holy and honorable, not in passionate lust like the pagans who do not know God." So basically with this argument, it's saying in the Bible that if you excessively indulge in sex, you're acting like the pagans and they don't even believe in God. So it's saying that when you indulge in the use of contraceptives, it turns into lust. It's not even love at that point. Finally, my position. I believe that using contraception is okay on some occasions. I believe that there are ways that women can use it to honor God, and there are other ways that directly disobey what He says. I think that having birth control in this day and age is a privilege, and that God gave people wisdom so that it could be created and then used to better our lives and our health. However, like most things, it should be used in moderation and should not be abused. From a Christian perspective, this means to not use it outside the context of a marriage, since sex was intended for a husband and a wife to create a bond but also to procreate. Therefore, I think it is right for a couple to be able to wait until marriage to have sex and to be able to use contraception at that point. Since it is still controversial about whether or not some contraceptives are abortifacient, married couples who fear accidentally aborting a child can simply just opt for a non-hormonal method. In regards to safety, however, it is important for you to understand that all bodies are different and that one form of contraception may not work the same way for you as it would for another person. That is why some of my pro and con arguments seem to contradict. Birth control may give one person increased moods throughout the day while giving another person severe depression. In the same way, people get different symptoms from a fever, i.e., some people get chills and other people sweat. This is the same type of concept. It is important to act because we leave ourselves vulnerable to unplanned pregnancies and health problems, and when it comes down to it, Having a child is a huge responsibility. If you and your spouse are not fit to have children, I believe that God wouldn't want you guys to just stop having sex because He still encourages it for intimacy purposes. But I also believe that at the same time, God wouldn't want you to deliberately not use the resources provided so that you could subject yourselves to having something that you aren't ready for or not properly equipped for. Therefore, by using contraception, I believe that it ends up saving children as well as the couple in the end, while still honoring God's intended use for sex. If you have any questions, I'm open for discussion and you can contact me through Teams. Or if you have my number, you could also text me. Thank you for listening to my card time. I hope you enjoyed it and that you learned something interesting about contraception that you didn't know previously. And I hope you have a good day. Thank you.